Welcome, everyone. My name is Pavlina Cherneva. I teach economics at the economics program at Bard College. I'm a research associate at the Levy Economics Institute and the director of the newly founded Economic Democracy Initiative at the Open Society University Network. It's my pleasure to welcome you to EDI, as we affectionately call it, EDI's inaugural Economic Democracy Address. EDI was formed around a simple recognition in mind, and namely that there cannot be economic well-being without economic security, and there cannot be an inclusive and just economy unless and until that economic security is provided to all, and I mean to all, without prerequisites or stipulations. We have the means. We have both the material and the financial means to eradicate economic insecurity. And we have the mandate, as articulated by the UN Declaration for Human Rights and countless international documents, national constitutions, treaties. Economic security and economic well-being are predicated on securing some fundamental economic rights. Among them, the right to a decent and remunerative employment, the right to housing and healthcare, the right to education and social security, and others, of course. We have the means and we have the mandate, but we also have a moral charge. And that is that policy must be reoriented to recognize that the economy must serve people and planet, not the other way around. Planet and people don't serve the market. And thus, the mission for OSUN's Economic Democracy Initiative is to support research, curricular development, student engagement programs that advance the understanding of the analytical and policy tools for achieving these basic economic rights. Though the focus is on economic, not political and civil rights, of course, they are inseparable. At heart, EDI is an interdisciplinary project, as none of today's complex challenges, from climate change to inequality to racial injustice or economic instability, can be tackled neatly within the confines of a single academic discipline. To this end, EDI brings to the OSUN community research to action lecture series, course development, a certificate in applied policy analysis, student-led research, and community engagement initiatives. And today I'm delighted to introduce to you the inaugural Economic Democracy Address. Our address features scholars, public intellectuals, and activists whose work on economic, social, and environmental justice is shaping the tenor of our time. And one of those public intellectuals is Professor Darrick Hamilton. Professor Hamilton is the Henry Cohen Professor of Economics and Urban Policy and a university professor at the New School for Social Research. He is also director of the Institute for the Study of Race, Stratification, and Political Economy at the New School. He is one of the leading scholars in the world in a field known as stratification economics, which is an intellectually rich approach to understanding inequality by race, class, gender, ethnicity, and other social groups. He has been involved in crafting policy proposals, including baby bonds, the federal jobs guarantee, and others. And they have garnered a great deal of media attention and served as inspiration for legislative proposals at the federal, the local, the national level. And he has served as a member of the Economic Committee of the Biden-Sanders Unity Task Force. He has testified before several Senate and House committees, including the Joint Economic Committee on the nation's potential policy responses to the COVID-19 pandemic, the health and economic fallout from it. He was a surrogate and an advisor for the Bernie Sanders presidential campaign, and he has advised numerous other leading members of Congress, as well as various 2020 presidential candidates. With this lecture, we are delighted to support the Racial Justice Initiative at Bard College. And on a personal level, I have to say that I've had the great pleasure to know Darrick for many years and collaborate with him. And I'm thrilled to have him as the inaugural speaker for the Economic Democracy Initiative. If we were in person, I would ask for a round of applause. So please join me in welcoming Professor Darrick Hamilton. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Let me lead with that. And all those accolades, one that I'm very proud of is that I am a colleague and friend of Pavlina. And we do a lot of work together, and I'm very proud of that. And this initiative is wonderful. What you all are doing, and this class, this approach of recognizing, one, markets are political constructions. And because they're political constructions, so are economies in general. And we can make choices about how we want to structure markets, economies. It's not just natural or some artifact from some positivist endeavor. Rather, as a society, we can attach norms to the ways in which we want distribution, production, as well as the means by which people have agency in their lives to be affected. So my talk today is going to center on what I think is a moral responsibility for the economics profession, and that is to put forth anti-racist policy regimes that neuter white supremacy and establish economic security for all. In fact, without an anti-racist policy regime, white supremacy is not only present, it's encouraged. Across the globe and throughout history, extreme inequality has persisted, and in plain sight, racism, sexism, and other isms, they're strategically used to consolidate economic and political power for some at the expense of others. This is unjust, this is immoral, and this is all about power relationships. Understanding the persistence of extreme inequality and the pivotal role that race and other group identities such as gender, disability status, sexual orientation, how they behave in forging political alignments and economic divisions, it should be core to any mission of an economist, a social scientist, and universities writ large. The time has come for us to be bold, transformative, and to use our scholarly endeavors to take the problems of inequality and stratification head on. A particular strength of university communities is its intellectual foundation, as well as the fact that it's shielded by the honors and privileges of tenure. It is this intellectual foundation that provides universities and faculties with a comparative advantage to conduct value-based, truth-seeking, rigorous research, however controversial that research may be. I can say my personal motivation is to be a scholar, not just for the love of knowledge or knowledge creation, but my objective as a scholar and an economist is to produce knowledge that with the explicit intent of building economic inclusion, civic engagement, and social equity, and what the Nobel laureate economist Amartya Sen has labeled human capabilities, enabling people to define and attain their self-determined goals. In doing these activities, one need not sacrifice rigor to understand how institutions and behaviors, how they intertwine with an objective of building economic inclusion. Likewise, we need to recognize that all scholarship is rooted in norms, especially scholarship that claims to study productions, transactions, and distributions. In other words, it's a ruse to believe that economics as a discipline is somehow void of norms, that it's just a positivist endeavor. Yet the term political economist has become an albatross, as if somehow the field is scientifically weaker, less objective than plain old economics. But as I mentioned, one need not sacrifice rigor to understand institutions and behaviors and how they intertwine as it relates to economic inclusion. I believe we should follow the mantra of the Reverend Dr. William Barber, one of the co-leaders of the Poor People's Campaign, where he has proclaimed that economic justice is a moral imperative. We need to embrace the principles of morality, decency, economic sustainability in our vision to plan if we want to address inequality and build a moral political economy. These values are critical for defining economic good and promoting authentic coalitions and decency across race, gender, and sexual orientation. We should note that racism is not simply an irrational prejudice, but a long leveraged strategic mechanism that has been used for exploitation and extrapolation that has benefited some at the expense of others. This global pandemic reveals a collective public health and economic vulnerability of a system that has actively produced inequality. But in plain sight, race still remains a focal point. In a just world, race, gender, ethnicity, nativity, they would have no transactional value in relation to any material, political, or social outcome. Yet the heaviest toll of the pandemic, well beyond class, falls on vulnerable racial and gender identity groups, both across and within nation state. And this will only serve to further expand upon existing inequalities and vulnerabilities. If we talk about pre-existing conditions, the biggest one of them all is wealth itself. Many Americans, Black and brown families in particular, they have low wealth, inadequate health care, and work in precarious but essential jobs. Jobs that have fewer workplace protections, lower wages, and fewer benefits. Wealthier families are better endowed to withstand financial hardship resulting from any emergency, including a global pandemic. The racially disparate treatment by law enforcement, as well as our disparate treatment in our health and economic exposure to the pandemic, it links to a larger political and economic vulnerability for Black Americans, as well as Latinx, Indigenous, and other people of color, whether we're in a pandemic or not. The immoral devaluation of Black lives has been ingrained in the American political economy, and it is long overdue for reckoning. We need a deeper understanding of how devaluing individuals based on some identity relate to political notions of who's deserving and who's undeserving. This understanding is essential to expand knowledge beyond conceptions of individual transactions into larger workings of political economic structures that really affect us all. The structures of our political economy go beyond race. The structures of our political economy and race go beyond class, individual bigotry, and as a matter of course, across the American landscape, race is strategically used to generate hierarchy and to propel systems of both persistent inequality and stratification. Despair and inequality are dramatic, and changes on the margins to address it won't cut it. To reverse these decades and generations of poverty, discrimination, and economic and political concentration at the top, we need a bold overhaul of our laws and our economy. The last half century of US policy has exacerbated this precarity and generated structures where essentially all of our nation's productivity gains have gone to elite and upper middle class families, while effectively flatlining real worker wages for everyone else. This has resulted in an obscene and undemocratic, dysfunctional concentration of wealth and power, especially by race, that we have not seen since the Gilded Age. We're going to need a profound change towards a more sustainable and moral economy with government interventions to facilitate assets, economic security, human dignity, and social mobility for all its people, regardless of their race, class, gender, sexual identity, or immigrant status. Whether we've realized it or not, the civil and political aspects of human rights, they are already ingrained in our public psyche. However, at least as important are economic rights. The right to assembly, the right to speech, the right to choice. It's limited for individuals who lack basic needs like a job, adequate income, shelter, food, or healthcare. What we're going to need is an industrial and trade policy that centers workers both domestically and abroad, coupled with an explicitly anti-racist, anti-sexist economic rights initiative. In response to that Gilded Age that I referenced before, that preceded the Great Depression that brought the American economy on near brinks of collapse, the New Deal reined in unfettered capitalism and corporate consolidation. And it provided a balance of power between labor and capital that set the foundation for a strong labor movement. However, it was not coincidental that by both design and implementation, Black people and Black institutions were largely frozen out from these gains. An example was the passage of the 1934 National Labor Relations Act, also known as the Wagner Act. That act that guaranteed Americans the right to organize and bargain collectively, and that served as the critical safeguard against workers against corporate exploitation. But because of the Faustian bargain to convince legislators in an apartheid-like Southern Jim Crow state to come aboard with the Wagner Act, we excluded Black Americans from these protections. It was not an accident that the Wagner Act excluded domestic and agricultural workers whom in the 1930s, 90% of Black women that were engaged in employment were employed in this sector, and over half of Black men. Still, I want to point out there's nothing new or radical about the concept of economic rights. President Franklin Roosevelt, in his 1944 State of the Union address, he called for an economic Bill of Rights. He called for, quote, physical security, economic security, social security, and moral security. He knew that full citizenship demanded more than political rights. It required economic rights. And the first article of his proposed Bill of Rights, second Bill of Rights, was the right to employment. That right to employment also has deep roots in our civil rights history. The Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King and the Poor People's Campaign, they focused on 5 tenets of government to provide economic rights. They called for the right to a meaningful job at a living wage, a secure and adequate income for all, access to land, access to capital, and the ability to truly play a significant role in government. In other words, civic engagement. A quote from the Reverend Martin Luther King says, 1, I am not convinced that the simplest approach will prove to be the most effective. I am now convinced that the simplest approach will prove to be the most effective. The solution to poverty is to abolish it directly. By now, and widely discussed measure, King called for guaranteed income. However, our contemporary political economy radically has situated the market as some great, efficient, self-regulating, colorblind arbiter of our worth and the solution for all our problems, whether they're economic or otherwise. Under this ideology, government interventions to promote social mobility, they're deemed inefficient or they're deemed counterproductive. Public provisioning to help the working class, they're purported to distort or worse, incentivize unproductive behaviors that would deter us from productive market-like behaviors. But race, along with in this paradigm, race, along with government social programs, they're used as scapegoats to fuel this neoliberal agenda. Poverty and inequality are attributed to deficiencies internal to the poor and Blacks themselves. Stigmatization based on race and anti-Blackness, they are strategically used as political fodder to implement harsh and punitive control on the underclass. Blacks have become the symbolism of undeserving, the symbolism of undeserving welfare queens, deadbeat dads, and super predators. And this is how we define a surplus population. And rather than empowering this surplus population, we manage them. We manage them as others. We engage in income maintenance rather than income mobility. We segregate them or socially isolate them. We conscript them to our military. We incarcerate them en masse. And we implement policies aimed at controlling their reproduction, their fertility, and how they form families. They are characterized as persistently unemployed and unemployable. They're characterized as a source of urban crime, malice, and whose subsistence needs we deem a drain on our fiscal budgets. That has fueled the rationale for austerity policies. If behavior modification, particularly with regards to personal and human capital investments, if that's the central issue, why fund government agencies and programs which at best misallocate precious resources to irresponsible individuals, or worse, create further dependencies that fuel more irresponsible behavior? In this system that I'm describing of labor exploitation and political economic consolidation, we have weaponized the words freedom and choice. They have become rhetorical devices intended to appeal to one's desire for agency in their lives rather than being called a victim. It feeds into a proverbial American narrative that through hard work, through effort, through individual effort, individuals can turn their proverbial rags into riches. We give individual anecdotes as evidence of the power of effort and market efficiency. But what we don't give in these individual anecdotes is what we don't have is the systematic evidence of the countless cases of hardworking individuals who are not able to attain social mobility, and likewise the anecdotes of individuals who are already born into privilege and who maintain that privilege regardless of whether they extend effort or not. The proverbial American narrative pays little attention to the roles of power and initial endowment or capital, and how power and capital can adjust to alter rules and structures of markets and transactions in general in order to privilege those with power and capital in the first place. What we know is that without any capital and without power, inequality is locked in. Again, we use words like choice and freedom to describe some benefit of the market, but choice is an illusion if an individual does not have a job, adequate income, shelter, food, or healthcare. It is literally wealth that gives us that choice, freedom, and optionality. Economic freedom and authentic agency, it's rooted in resources. It's rooted in political, social, psychological, and especially material resources. Power and capital, they are self-reinforcing, and without government interventions, they will do what they do best. They will consolidate, it will iterate, and it will exclude and enrich some at the exclusion of others. In our economy, wealth and capital, they're used to capture social, economic, and political power. They're used to enable those who inherit this power the ability to change the rules or rig the system to further create favor for that concentration of wealth and power. But it's critical to note that it was never the case when we think about history that a white middle class based in assets simply emerged. Rather, it was government policy, and to a large extent, literally government giveaways, entitlements that provided whites with the finance, education, land, infrastructure to accumulate wealth and pass it down across generations. That in and of itself is not a bad thing. However, what is bad is that, as in the case of the Wagner Act described above, by design and implementation, Black students and Black institutions, like HBCUs, they were largely excluded from these benefits. Our unjust racial wealth gap is itself an implicit measure of our racist past that's rooted in a history in which whites have been privileged by government-complicit political and economic interventions that have afforded them access to resources. This is in contrast to a history in which Black people and Indigenous people, their personhood and whatever capital or material resources they may have established have always been vulnerable to exploitive, and extrapolative, state complicit confiscation, destruction, terror, fraud, theft, and other acts of violence. I'd like to remind us we're about to come up on the 100th anniversary of that Tulsa massacre that literally took wealth and killed people 100 years ago. As a result, today, Blacks as a group have very little ownership of America's land or means of production, and they remain in fear of violence, fear of incarceration, and literally bondage. This history of disenfranchisement of Black Americans from full economic participation, it's well documented. Policies like redlining, highway construction, failure to desegregate schools at the metropolitan level, exclusionary zoning, they have all worked in tandem with restrictive covenants, regulatory controls to marginalize Black Americans and constrain their economic participation as well as their political power. Yet we frame the racial wealth gap, including the use of alternative financial service products, by focusing on poor financial choices and decision-making on the part of largely Black, Latinx, and poor borrowers. The framing is tied to a culture of poverty thesis in which Blacks are presumed to undervalue and have a low acquisition of education. That framing is wrong. The directional emphasis is wrong. It's more likely that meager economic circumstance, not poor or deficient decision-making or knowledge, that poor resources constrain choice itself, and it leaves poor borrowers with little to no other financial options but to attain and use predatory and abusive financial service products. Financial behavior, financial literacy, they are practically useless for households with no finances to manage in the first place. If we think about debt, what we traditionally conceive of as good and bad debt, it has different implications when we consider race and we consider the prevailing framework of targeting unprivileged racial groups with inferior housing and educational products, with predatory finance, as well as ongoing housing and labor market discrimination that limits the choice set, as well as the rate of return on home ownership or college degree based on one's race and ethnicity. If we think about student debt, it's noteworthy that on average, Black college graduates owe about $53,000 in student debt 4 years after graduation. This is despite the misperception that Black students don't value education. In fact, Black college graduates are now overrepresented in graduate education relative to their share in the population overall. Basically, Black students might be pursuing a resume building strategy to overcome their discrimination. Black students tend to take on more debt at every level of higher education, and they're more likely than white students to drop out of university because of financial concerns, in large part because Blacks comparatively have lower household finance levels from which they began in the first place. Yet and still, high achieving Black Americans, when we measure it by education, they still exhibit large economic and health disparities relative to their white peers. And when it comes to both health and wealth, these disparities grow at higher levels of education. The fact that a Black person who lives in the fact that Blacks who live in families where the head graduated from college typically have less wealth than white head of households who dropped out of high school, that's an example of a property right in whiteness. The fact that a Black expectant mother with a college degree is more likely to have an infant death than a white expectant mother who dropped out of high school, as well as the fact that a Black man with a college degree is 3 times more likely to die from stroke than a white man who dropped out of high school. These are all exemplary of the property rights in whiteness. This pattern of persistent or worsening racial disparity with education, it's not limited to infant mortality and stroke, but it also is evident in virtually every other major disease type, including cancer, heart disease, and HIV-related cases. Yet for the most part, our literature, our economic and health literature, has focused both implicitly and explicitly on lower socioeconomic status of Blacks and its perceived confluence with detrimental behaviors as the explanations for the racial health disparities that I cited to you above. Even the literature that examines racial discrimination as the determinant is largely geared towards framing low socioeconomic status of Blacks and discrimination against this group as the mechanism. In essence, few studies explore that paradox of increasing health disparities with higher levels of socioeconomic status that I cited to you above. The emergent consensus that the social determinants of health from the World Health Organization, it defines the conditions in which individuals are born, grow, and live as the primary determinants of health and likewise health disparities. The presumption is that with this narrative is that if a greater share of Black and Latinx individuals invested more in a good education, this in turn would result in better jobs, higher income, and health disparity would dramatically reduce or be eliminated. What we know is that education is positively associated with better health and better economic conditions for Americans within group. However, racial disparity in health, labor, financial markets, not only do they persist, they often worsen at higher levels of education. More broadly, Black men and women between the ages of 25 and 64, they have about a 50% higher mortality rate than their white counterpart. But what's more disheartening is that these disparities for Black men and women with a college degree, they have a 70% higher mortality rate than similarly educated whites. So education matters within group, but since social structures do not permit Black people to convert education into desired outcomes at the same rate as it does whites, they are not protected by their social class status in the same way that whites are. Racial differences in key outcomes cannot be fully explained by a clustering amongst the less skilled. Unsurprisingly, within each group, more education is associated with better outcomes. However, the irony is that across group, Black workers with a college degree are most harmed relative to similarly qualified white workers. And a paper that we recently produced at our institute demonstrates that this difference is amplified during recessions. In essence, education is not the magic antidote for the enormous racial disparities that result from state complicit laws, policies, and economic arrangements. I'm a university professor, and I'm not intending to diminish the value of education. There's clear intrinsic value to education, along with a public responsibility to expose everyone to a high quality education with the teachers trained to, with teachers that are empathetic, that trains them to synthesize and fuse information into big ideas and deliver this curriculum from grade school all the way through college. But what is a myth is that Black families do not value education. But what is also problematic is the societal emphasis or overemphasis on the economic returns to education as the panacea to address these structural barriers that I've been describing. We overstate the functional role of education to the detriment of understanding the functional roles of wealth and power in the first place. Indeed, I wonder if this overemphasis on the emphasis to promote economic opportunity, is that a political ruse? In other words, is the rhetorical aspiration for equal opportunity a mechanism, a tactic to facilitate the hoarding of resources for the elite and upper middle class? Basically, if framing inequality as an opportunity gap, does that serve a purpose of reinforcing market norms that put the onus of inequality on individuals while absolving the state from public responsibility? Economists should do a better job of understanding how power and capital in our political economy impact who has and who does not have. And we should be more focused on advocating for structures that truly lead to equitable and fair distributions. We are not atomistic agents floating in unfettered markets guided by some free will or free hand into fair and efficient allocation. The conventional economic view that race prejudice is some exogenously determined binary based on some bigotry, some preferences, some taste, or even ignorance. That should be arbitraged by non-bigoted firms who are profit-seeking. All that ignores the strategic agency and benefits that individuals have in both choosing and investing in their collective group identity, and how we have social structures that may increase or decrease the value of that incentive to invest in one's identity. We should do a better job of understanding this power. So here's a key to my talk. There's a trade-off to forge political alignment between capital and politically dominant working class groups. We need to understand who benefits from social stratification. We need to fully understand how a status quo and an iterative cycle of concentrated economic and political power, how it's able to persist for so long. In order to understand that, we need to embrace a third pillar in the relationship between politics and economics. And that third pillar is race. It's not an issue, it's a pillar. Or more broadly, the existence of a permanent underclass marked by some subaltern identity by which more dominant identity groups are able to maintain a political status quo by sacrificing their vertical position, in other words, having growing overall inequality, in exchange for horizontal positioning or social status or relative position. In other words, a dominant white working political class might be willing to go along with growing inequality in exchange for relative positioning, in exchange for social status. Hence, there becomes greater currency attached to white supremacy. To understand this, we got to get beyond class reductionism and recognize that race and social identities are pillars alongside political and economic power. There are intermediate economic and psychological benefits associated with distancing oneself from the out-group. In the American case, that would be Black Americans, towards some in-group identity, which in the case of the United States, that would be a white American identity. This fits into the frame of the classical sociologist Herbert Blumer and his thesis that, quote, race prejudice exists basically in a sense of group position rather than a set of feelings which members of one racial group have towards members of another racial group. Basically, group relative position will transcend individual feelings. That's the point. That's the impetus for the psychological and material benefits of white privilege and the property rights and whiteness. But we can recognize that this privilege is grounded in an amoral or immoral notion of benefit. It's an immoral notion of benefit that's largely predicated on self-interested, neoliberal, and tribal norms in which we have accumulation with no bounds. An authentic racial coalition to address our growing paradigm of inequality, it is going to necessitate that the white dominant group give up the benefits of white privilege. But I should point out that this is not an easy ask. To achieve racial justice, we need an honest and sobering confession of the historical sins of slavery, a point in which Black people were literally capital assets for a white landowning plantation class. But not just slavery, for sharecropping, for white capping, for Jim Crow and other exclusions of Blacks from New Deal and post-war policies that built an asset-based white middle class. The authentic analysis would counter that neoliberal frame that has characterized Black, brown, and poor people in general. We have racialized white poor people that characterize them as white welfare queens, as deadbeat dads, as undeserving. And instead, it would pave the way for new narratives that more accurately frame inequality as grounded in what it's grounded in, and that's resource deprivation. However, acknowledgement alone, it's empty if not accompanied by some form of material redress. Reparations provides a retrospective, direct, and parsimonious approach to address Black-white racial wealth gap. Moreover, it would be a racially just policy because it requires the US to take public responsibility and atone for its long history of racial injustice. But reparations wouldn't be enough. A seed capital program like baby bonds or child trust accounts, it would be also economically and racially just, and it would be a prospective approach, since it targets the domain and outcome in which whites and Blacks have very little overlap, and that's existing wealth itself. A permanent seed capital program would provide everyone with a capital foundation so that they're able to build wealth and asset security in perpetuity. We know that without it, we will have capital doing what it does best, which is consolidate. So a baby bonds program would trend us towards a more just and egalitarian distribution of capital and provide wealth access. And to address wealth inequality in general, we need a wealth tax. If we want to address plutocracy, the fact that we have such high concentrations of wealth at the top, along with the political power that comes along with that concentration, we need something to break up that capital. What's more is that we need bold, transformative, anti-racist, anti-sexist policies that by design and implementation, so here's what I mean by anti-racist, are intentionally inclusive in their design and implementation of all racial, ethnic, and gender groups. There's a set of enabling goods and services that are so critical for individual life, liberty, and self-determination that their quantity, quality, and access to them should not be vulnerable to the pricing and rationing that come about from firms trying to meet for-profit fiduciary responsibilities to their shareholders. We need policies where public options directly compete with and crowd out inferior private options, options that do not ensure universal and quality health care, universal and quality housing, schooling, financial services, capital, and the free mobility throughout society without the psychological and physical threat of detention or bodily harm at the hands of a state-sanctioned terror. Throughout this talk, I've been emphasizing state-sanctioned terror because someone's identity is linked to a vulnerable or stigmatized group. For instance, by mandating the economic right to health insurance, society would effectively remove the burden and stigma associated with finance at the point in which we are most vulnerable, and that's the delivery of medical care. Whereas cost and profit considerations drive private insurers to ration quantity, to ration quality, and access to medical care, such concerns would be recognized and met long before that point of delivery under a publicly provided mandate to health insurance coverage. We should also be looking to initiate the economic right to a productive and quality job, along with the economic security of a living wage and worker amenities that also invest in our public physical and human infrastructure. I'm not talking about an employer of last resort program, but a viable alternative to undesirable low pay, low benefits, and poor working conditions. The jobs would address our 21st century physical and human capital infrastructure needs, including the provisions of universal care work and our increasing vulnerability to natural disasters resulting from unnatural climate change. All these things are going to require substantial public investment. This approach would trend us towards dismantling the material consequences and social stigma associated with identity groupings. But let me be clear, I'm not calling for the end of identity or the end of affinity groups, but rather I'm calling for its end as it relates to the importance of relative material outcomes. Our current economic system is founded upon values of self-interested accumulation without bounds, values of greed and exploitation. But our economy should be grounded in different values. Values of economic inclusion, civic engagement, social equity, human dignity, sustainability, and shared prosperity. The good news is that change may be happening. We've witnessed across all 50 states and the entire globe in 2020, people shouting with solidarity that Black lives matter. So the question is, are younger generations and social movements, are they beginning to redefine economic good, to embrace the principles of morality, common humanity, and sustainability? We know that these are necessary ingredients if we're ever going to have that authentic coalition across our various identities to address our common paradigms of inequality. I don't know the answer to that, but alas, I do know that without potent policy alternatives grounded in economic justice that neuter racist regimes and provide pathways for economic security and self-determination for all people, white supremacy and the despotic political appeal to divisive leadership will always remain. So I'm going to leave you with some encouragement to commit to justice, commit to it as a matter of faith. Similar to how the economic discipline has committed to the dogma of markets and efficient distribution, a so-called efficient distribution, as a matter of faith. Timeliness of these ideas shouldn't constrain us. We should be undeterred by what people think is possible and not possible in a here and now. What we should ultimately do is commit to shared prosperity and recognize that it is our monetary system, it is our government, and ultimately it is our economy. Thank you.
Thank you, Darrick, very, very much for this inspirational talk and really for your work, just debunking these myths of individual responsibility, these cultural tropes of, group-based deficits and that are replacing all the old tropes that are a little more politically palpable today about, cultural forces, and they're just thinly veiled kind of racist, ideas that just reproduce the structures of inequity and inequality. I want to open it to questions. I'll moderate it. If you can raise your hand, you can ask in the chat. But I also want to thank you for sort of your radical imagination, that it's not just enough to bust the myths, but also kind of present a vision of inclusivity that is kind of a moral commitment, and really to highlight that we have the tools, that these are not unsurmountable in a material sense challenges. Just one question that I wanted to ask you. During the presidency, Obama's presidency, we heard a lot about initiatives like My Brother's Keeper or Ladders of Opportunity. Can you talk a little bit about, how helpful and unhelpful those were? In what way they may have sort of reproduced some old ideas? To what degree did we make progress by using these kinds of initiatives and notions of opportunity?
Yeah. I'm gonna be blunt. My Brother's Keeper, its framing is racist. Are Black people supposed to be Cain? What is, it's a biblical framing that goes back to Cain and Abel. Some of the rhetoric around the policy was one of how do we leverage private and charitable resources, public and charitable resources. And that's the key. It wasn't even just a public endeavor. It was leveraging public and charitable resources to incentivize defective Black males to behave more accordingly. So, it might have been well-meaning. I don't question anybody's motive, but I will say that it was racist in its rhetoric. So I actually think that it fed into these market-based narratives that, where we want to facilitate laissez-faire for everyone, deregulation, but for poor people, they're poor because of their deficit behaviors and attitudes. So what we need to do is offer some enrichment, some incentives, without addressing the material deprivation in the first part.
Yeah. And it seems to absolve the public sector from the responsibility to provide the preconditions for all, where economic rights come in, that, you can make all the right choices and the right, make the right decisions, but as your work shows, you will not have the equal chance at a job. You will not have an equal chance at wealth building, wealth creation. And it is incumbent on us to provide truly inclusive guarantees to all for these economic opportunities. So let me turn it to the students. I have.
And while you do that, can I say something else a little more that at some point, it'd be even useful to delve deeper into what's a good public-private or public-nonprofit relationship, and should they exist at all anyway? I mean, my conception is a good use of charitable resources is to take bold to provide demonstration to maybe incentivize states to act. So take risk in ways that states aren't able to take risks, like a basic income experiment or federal job guarantee experiment. But if the resources are going from state to charitable entities, or there's some collaboration with charitable entities to deliver on what the state should be doing itself, is that anti-democratic? Is that allowing an elite infrastructure to come in and leverage public resources in a way that's counter to what democracy is supposed to be doing?
Yeah, securing rights, right, is the question. What is the best vehicle to secure that rights? And since the public sector has the ultimate financial resources and command over other resources, the buck ultimately stops there. And how do we bring in civil society in this overall mission for economic inclusivity and justice for all? Let me turn lots of questions from the students. I'll start with, Tyrone had his hand first.
Hi, Darrick. How's it going? I'm working with a couple of local candidates in Minneapolis and St. Paul, Minnesota, and they're working on their housing policies. I'm wondering what you would advise them to do, because they're thinking about, do we focus on just building a lot of publicly owned housing that would help everybody, targeting poor people and minorities? Or would you think about home ownership, considering especially what you said today and in the past about how people of color who own homes, they don't get to see the big increases in value that white people sometimes see? What's the trade-off, or how would you think about that?
Yeah, how you doing, first off, and thank you for that question. I guess, there's several elements in that question. One is, in the American context, home ownership has served as a depository for generating wealth. It's not causal. When people say home ownership drives wealth and racial wealth inequality, from an economist standpoint, that's like saying wealth drives wealth. Because to get into home ownership, what you need is a down payment in the first place. So home ownership is not causal, but rather home ownership, because of various public policy mechanisms like preferred tax status and even some FHA government policies, has served as a storage of wealth, or perhaps even a vehicle of wealth for many families, but as was pointing out, not for Black families. So given that, we should be thinking about ways to reform home ownership to provide greater accessibility in a more just manner. But we should also think about housing as a right. So independent of the wealth creating vehicle that home ownership may serve in the US context, as Pavlina has described eloquently, the right to housing should be a basic human right. So that's the framing. In terms of answering the question more directly with regards to policies, local entities are budgetary constrained in ways that the federal government isn't. So when targeting local entities, there is a reality of budget constraints, but if we think about ways in which they can distribute those scarce resources in most effective ways, I can tell you what might not be the best effective way. Tax incentives, either to cajole residents to come into certain neighborhoods to develop it, or public-private partnerships with an eye towards preferred tax status or even public subsidies. In my view, those are inferior mechanisms than direct capital investments themselves, and actually could have detrimental effects like enhancing gentrification. So in the case of tax abatements, who has the initial wealth to begin with to take advantage of such an incentive in a neighborhood that might offer some tax preferred status for people to go in and purchase a home there? Well, not Black people, because they're virtually a zero wealth population to begin with. And then we also see the lessons with inclusionary zoning of either housing development or business development with these, I forgot the term, but these local what's it called? I forgot the term, but bargaining agreements where the firm is obligated to supply X number of low-income housing units or X number of jobs. They renege on them. They renege on these approaches in ways that aren't enforceable by the local entity to make them initiated. So we have seen from history that firms with their for-profit motivation, whether we want to cast moral judgment or not, their responsibility isn't to the residents of that area, but rather to their shareholders, in which case we end up with approaches that subsidize firms in ways that grow inequality rather than direct implementation of the resources to those that need it the most.
Eli, go ahead.
Professor Hamilton, thank you so much for joining us. In your talk, you mentioned that MLK argued for guaranteed income as one of many means of tackling racial inequality. What are your thoughts on a federal jobs guarantee versus the universal basic income in terms of outcomes for racial wealth inequality?
Yeah, so first off, I'm opposed to UBI, period. Universal basic income has the affect of promoting inequality. I know that the argument is that they will, if you give everybody $100, those at the top of the distribution, they will have less consumption needs, and it will probably further facilitate their investment portfolio. If you give somebody at the low end of the distribution $100, by definition, they'll consume it because they're poor and they have subsistence needs. So you end up generating inequality by creating the wealth gap. It's not an effective approach because it dilutes the value of $100. If you gave everybody in New York City $100, you might expect landlords to simply raise the rent by $100 and capture it all. So it dilutes the power of the money. It has inflationary trends, and it's inequality enhancing. That said, I'm supportive of guaranteed income. And I think we need not juxtapose federal job guarantee with guaranteed income. I mean, if I had to pick my preference, I would go with federal job guarantee. But the notion of pitting one social program versus the other is a trap that people on the left have fallen into, in my experience, that we have the resources to generate an economic rights portfolio, that we can guarantee health insurance and provide basic income and provide a federal job guarantee. So I'm completely supportive of taking the earned income tax credits tax structure that we have today and literally allowing for guaranteed income with that structure. The payments can be made more periodic. We could reduce the arbitrary decision to require work and ensure that everyone has access to some basic income. We could expand the phase out period on the back end to promote more families going to the middle class. So, we have the tools already in place. if we attach values that ensures that everybody has at least a adequate income, I think that the existing structure and using tax reform that's economically inclusive, that promotes civic engagement. Why is it that on tax day, everybody doesn't partake in taxes? And the notion of thinking of taxes only as revenue collection as opposed to being able to promote economic inclusion, that's also a farce. We've seen from the pandemic that the IRS and Treasury can directly send checks to the American people in ways to promote economic security. So I think we need to reimagine taxes altogether and think about it as a way of promoting government fiduciary responsibilities of equity, economic inclusion, and civic engagement. And EITC is a mechanism to promote guaranteed income if we do some reforms.
Thank you. Ashley, I think you had your hand next.
Cicely was actually before me, but
Oh, okay. I didn't see it. Somebody go.
do you want to go, Cicely?
Sorry, yeah, I had trouble clicking the unmute thing. I will. Thank you, Professor Hamilton, for coming and speaking. I wanted to ask you a question that was posed in a different class that I'm taking, but I think it still applies. So because our economy is a capitalist economy and stratifies and encodes racial and other moral injustices, do you think that a capitalism can exist that does not depend on the exploitation of people and the environment?
You know, I think that terms like capitalism and socialism are very useful in the academy if we're understanding models and trends. But in practice, we don't practice complete capitalism. You know, when we bailed out the banks as a result of the Great Depression, that wasn't capitalism. You know, I think neoliberalism was a better and more accurate description that emphasizes not only economic systems, but political orientations that's grounded in some norms that firms are the sole job creators, and that if we emphasize industrial policy directed at promoting firms, that this is somehow going to trickle down and benefit us all. You know, that ultimately ain't capitalism. But and I don't want to be a cop-out to answer your question. I think it's a larger political economy system, but ultimately, I think that whether you have a more capitalist or socialist orientation, and that's ultimately we're talking about orientations, what we need is an economic rights framework. So whether you have a taste for more private interactions or public provisions, whether you're going to do either one of those, at a baseline, there needs to be economic rights.
Thank you, Ashley.
Hi, thank you so much for coming. I read a lot of your work, and specifically your preference for whiteness paper was devastating, but also very compelling to read. I actually presented on that in a class I'm taking on a seminar on discrimination, it was really cool to dig into that. But I kind of wanted to ask you, kind of in relation to that paper and also your talk today, how can we shift from focusing sort of collectively on like pre-market factors to the structural and institutional faults in our politics and economy? Because I see a lot of people, you know, having the culture of poverty perspective and also saying, you know, educate yourself out of these poverty traps and these kind of racialized sort of, I guess, paradigms and outcomes. And I'm just wondering, like, how can we shift that focus in a way that leads to tangible change, I guess? Yeah.
I mean, great questions, all of you. This is a wonderful class. I want to say, Pavlina, you're privileged to be able to have this class with this level of engagement and knowledge that you bring to the class. So I am growing as a scholar in my political economy orientation. That iteration of papers was very applied micro, where I understood relationships. And to get to solutions, I think you got to get to political economy framing. And what I'm coming to in my line of thought as a conclusion is that the culture of poverty thesis isn't just ignorance. It isn't just something that's a myth. It's intentional with a purpose. And that the counter to that intention and that purpose is a policy regime that mitigates the incentives for white privilege. And then perhaps leads to a different orientation of values to begin with. And now we have chicken and egg problems of, how do we get to the policy regime without the values first? And I don't know all those answers. I know that, there becomes conditions where, and I'm gonna be all over the place in answering this question, so sorry. Neoliberalism today is on the ropes. And why do I know? What's the evidence? There's a great essay by Chris Hughes that came out in Time magazine, I think yesterday or a couple of days ago, where he pretty much is proclaiming that market economies are, if he doesn't say dead, are close to dead. And what's the evidence? The infighting within politics, the fact that we had a scenario of Donald Trump who didn't run on a capitalist platform. He ran as a populist, although he acted in a way that enriched capital class. What's the other evidence? The takeover of the Capitol building, the protests, even in a pandemic. Your generation went through the Great Depression, went to college and accumulated record levels of debt, are faced with another scarring from this pandemic. And your attraction to the narrative that all you got to do is study hard and work hard and you'll be fine, y'all are pushing back against that. Y'all are pushing back in ways that demand justice, that says that it's just wrong that somebody's poor. So, is this a scenario of young people being more politically radicalized? And I hate to use that word radicalized, or is it really a generational shift? It seems to me that we have preconditions that it might be a generational shift. So, if you're, and I'm hopeful that, we can even look at Joe Biden. I had the conversation with Pavlina before we started this. In a lot of ways, we are both pleasantly surprised. We demand more. We're not satisfied by some of the rhetoric and some of the actions that he's taken. 5-10 years ago, we couldn't have imagined that a president, much less Joe Biden, would be claiming that everything we do has to center race equity. And this is not shade to him. This is applaud. So, to come back to the answer to the question, I fundamentally believe that to neuter white supremacy, we need an anti-racist policy regime that promotes economic rights and leaves poorer whites or working class whites less vulnerable to the seduction that comes along with not being the first fired, not being the last hired. The seduction that comes along with, however poor I may be, at least I'm not Mexican, that trade-off between relative status and vertical status becomes more appealing the more unequal we are. So we need a shift in values that value things beyond self-interested tribal norms and recognize the values of common humanity, the values in shared responsibility, collective efficacy, as well as the policies to match that leaves us less vulnerable to that divisive, despotic appeal to fascism.
That's right. Yep. All right, Nick, welcome. Welcome to this session. Your question next.
Thank you. It was nice listening to what you had to say. I was gonna ask a question on the topic of wealth inequality. I know there's been currently a lot of talk about taxing the rich and just raising taxes, but I was wondering if you thought a more effective measure would just to be able to give the tax collectors more resources to do their jobs, so tax increases wouldn't necessarily, or do you think we should do both?
Yeah. Probably no surprise, I'm going to say we need to do both. But then let me even talk about my conception, and a lot of this is influenced by the great leaders like your instructor from MMT that have dispelled some of the myths that we don't have the monetary power to fund our productive needs. So for me, taxing the rich serves a particular purpose. Not that I begrudge the wealthy, but they got too much power in our society. You know, when the majority of people agree that climate change is an issue, or when the majority of people agree that we need a federal job guarantee, but we're thwarted by lobbying because you have a wealthy elite that may lose in a short term, that's a problem for democracy. That's plutocratic. So that distortional power is fueled by a concentration of wealth where the top 0.1% of earners in our country, and I shouldn't even use the word earner, the top 0.1% of those that are at the high end of the distribution have as much of the nation's wealth as the bottom 90%. That has to translate into political power as well. So that's why we need to tax the wealthy, to rein in plutocracy. And then, I'll say, the additional resources we get in our federal coffers, if we use it in a more effective and efficient way, that's good economics. What other point did I want to make? I think that's it. I forgot the last point.
Okay, thanks, Darrick. All right, we'll have Daniel. You can close us out unless there are other questions. Go ahead.
This question might be a little change of speed from what we've been doing, but as a Black kid from Atlanta who's been to like high poverty areas, I guess, such as Bankhead and Cleveland Avenue on the east side of Atlanta, because these classes like this are cool, where a lot of people speak on the ways to solve stuff, but when do you think we'll actually see those things being solved? Because I don't really see much improvement when I go to these different places and when I see my friends and family in these different places. And because we've endured like a lifetime of pain, suffering, inequality, and stuff like that, which has affected the African-American community in a lot of different ways that people don't see. And I think it comes to fruition in ways that affect our mentality and how African-Americans are involved when it comes to the economy and stuff like that. How do you think we can, I guess, not change the mentality, but kind of further push this education in predominantly Black communities? Because a lot of African-American kids are not going to be able to reach this point and be in a class like this and have these kind of conversations and be confident enough to speak up or speak about the different things that they've gone through, because statistics and what we actually go through are a lot different. A lot of times we speak about statistics like the white man has this much money and has this much employment rate versus Black people, the Black man's employment rate, stuff like that. But the actual things that we go through in these different places and the treatment that we receive in these different places is a lot different than the statistics put out to be. And even though that's not really a statistic, our real life experiences, it should be factored in just as such. I know that's like weird because it's like a question, not a question, different things, but I just was curious on your, as a minority as well, on what you thought about that. Because a lot of people don't take that into consideration. They don't have to.
Yeah. I appreciate that question, and my response might be emotional because what you describe is emotional. I'm at a level of maturity in my life and my career that I'm okay with being emotional. These problems are emotional. This is why morality has to be central in our discussions of economy. It has been perpetuated as a myth that somehow morality is devoid from political economy, that the grown-ups in the room can somehow just be scientific without ideas of what's right and what's wrong. 2 points. I led off the conversation saying that that's a misnomer. I don't know if y'all have covered the 2 welfare theorems of economics, but if you have, you would know that saying that those things are without norms, but particularly positivist, that's BS. That started from somebody's conception or view of defining value in and of itself. So, everything is grounded in norms and values. Then you do the rigor to see if, because we're truth seekers, we want to put forth whatever tools we have to understand relations to seek out the truth. But let me say that, going back, these problems are real. These are real people. They might be people we know. They could be us. We could have come from these type of environments. So there is a huge moral imperative to address this inequality and to do what we can and what we should. University communities, we have the privilege of lots of public subsidy, even a system of tenure that allows us to have a job in perpetuity without the fear of losing that job. So, I call upon my brethren really to take this up too, that we have a big responsibility to address these problems. So, again, I know I'm abstract. I'm gonna try to get real in answering the questions, but I wanted to lead with the point that I acknowledge all the things that you said. And these are real people in real lives, and it's inhumane that people got to live in these scenarios. And what's even more pernicious is something like an arbitrary identity of race, a scientifically arbitrary. It's socially relevant because we give it relevance. That's the deciding factor of who has and who doesn't have. Let me also point out that we often say that, because Black people face all this despair, they're unmotivated. They will wallow in their circumstances, and that becomes part of that culture of poverty thesis. There's lots of empirical evidence to counter that narrative, that even in these difficult circumstances that are resource deprived, Black people overachieve relative to the norm. And what is the theoretical foundation of why they may overachieve? Because they might expect that they're going to face discrimination. When I gave you the statistic that Black college graduates are overrepresented in graduate school, that's counter the norm that, if I'm going to go to work for a firm, I'm going to get paid less than the white person. So why bother get education? It's more consistent with an incentive where you say, I got to work twice as hard to get by. Now, when I say work twice as hard to get by, let me also point out that society doesn't ask what is the cost of that working twice as hard to get by. And some of those health statistics that I cited to you, that very well may be the cost. We may be dying earlier because of that additional effort associated with trying to overcome your structural barriers. Now I'm going to try to get to the question. I don't know when change can happen. I know we have precedents where change has happened. So the question of can it happen, the answer is yes, and we can cite many examples. But what I do know also is that pessimism and despair feeds into the status quo. Notions of inevitability, those are also strategies by the status quo and the dominant class to keep us from promoting change. So whether change happens today, tomorrow, again, here's what I'm trying to implore upon you. You should look for evidence when you engage in endeavors. You should look for not only a theoretical foundation, but empirical evidence that support whether your reality is real or not. But when it comes to justice, here's where I'm asking you to take a leap of faith. Commit to it no matter what. Commit to it whether it's going to happen today or tomorrow. Commit to it whether the despair seems overwhelming or not, because it's right. This is the part where I'm trying to appeal to a spiritual notion. It's inhumane to do anything else. That it should be done as a matter of faith.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sir Daniel, for this question. To close out this session, Darrick, your words, I was hearing James Baldwin in my ears that, we can't be pessimists because that is accepting that life is an academic matter, and it certainly is not an academic matter. And urge all of us to think that it's incumbent on us to confront and face racism and economic injustice in all of its forms, wherever we may meet it. I'm grateful to you for this wonderful and inspirational talk, and we hope to have you back again. Thank you so very much.
Thank you. I hope to come back. This was fun, a whole lot of fun.
Thank you to the students. Thank you for your wonderful questions. Thanks for all the guests who joined us.
Cheers.